Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Gales. I'm the overall manager of the doc team at Splunk, and we have a great program set up for you today. Requisite forward-looking statement. Actually not relevant to the presentation. So the agenda is we're going to have a small series of 4 lightning talks, and then we'll have some Q&A afterwards. And with that, we'll turn it over to Matt Ness.
So hi, my name is Matt Ness. I'm a principal technical writer for Splunk, and I'm also the writer with the most seniority in the doc team. I've been with the company for almost 10 years. And at this point, I feel a bit like the actor J.K. Simmons on those farmers insurance ads. I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. This lightning talk is about my time at Splunk. There's a lot I could say, but I'll keep it brief and you can ask me questions later. Now, when I joined Splunk, I didn't know I'd be there for almost 10 years. To be honest, I wasn't sure if I'd be there for more than 3 months. Why? Well, when I joined in October 2008, a financial crisis was brewing. And I still remembered how the dot-com crash back in 2000 led to a domino tumble of startup closures. I'd been a victim of one, and it wasn't pretty. So this Splunk opportunity seemed like a risk in disguise. For all I knew, the company would be dried up in a matter of months, a victim of the oncoming recession. So I went in for an interview, and right away I knew it was different from the places I'd worked before. There was a wild energy in the office, a sense of barely controlled chaos. One of the guys who interviewed me introduced himself as the Duke of Fun. There was a gamerator in the office, which was basically a video game machine with a keg in it. And I had the hiring manager, Rachel, was introduced or let me know that she played Dungeons and Dragons, and all of this sounded really cool to me at the time. It seemed a bit crazy and a bit silly and a bit chaotic, and that was kind of what I needed at the time. So I took the leap. And long story short, Splunk survived the recession, had an IPO 4 years later, and now it's big and successful. Even though Splunk sometimes seemed like a lawless frontier town back in 2008, I could see how it might grow into a somewhat respectable enterprise software company over time. This was because I'd worked at a company that had a similar look and feel back in the 90s. That company was PeopleSoft, and they made enterprise software. During the 5 years that I was there, PeopleSoft grew from 1,000 to 10,000 employees. Throughout most of that time, they retained a fun and open company culture. When I joined PeopleSoft, I became a member of a doc team with 12 writers. When I left, PeopleSoft had 114 writers and editors spread across several product teams. Throughout most of my first several years at Splunk, it often felt like the Splunk doc team was following a script I'd seen play out at PeopleSoft decades before. In the early days of both doc teams, the starting assumption was, we are writing for an audience of American sysadmins, make them happy. This is a fine strategy for young companies. You're small, generally understaffed, and have tons of fresh, new, foundation-level documentation to write. And there's no time to worry about the niceties. Get it out there by any means necessary. Don't worry about writing for audiences you don't have yet. You can make it pretty later. But if my experience at PeopleSoft was any guide, Splunk's attitude about documentation would have to change if things worked out so the company grew and started selling products to wider varieties of customers in international markets. So Splunk's documentation department evolved, and here's where we're at now. It's where I predicted we'd end up all those years ago. We're writing for lots of audiences, both in terms of translation and user personas. We've got a set of full-time editors keeping us on our toes, and we're developing content patterns to help with standardization. We're continually developing and implementing ways to write better and work smarter. All that said, the Splunk documentation team goes above and beyond my prior experience in a number of ways. Here's one example. We talk to our readers. We solicit feedback on our documentation pages and they provide it. This is the sort of thing I could only dream of earlier in my career. At a previous employer, maybe once in a blue moon, someone in support would tell you that a customer reported a problem with a topic. One of my previous doc teams convened a focus group to find out what our customers thought of our docs. But at Splunk, we communicate directly with our customers, and in some cases, we develop friendly relationships with them. You'll learn more about this from one of my colleagues in this panel. Here's another example, Reading for Writing, the Splunk Doc Team Book Club. The book club keeps us on top of current technical documentation techniques. We put a lot of what we learned from these books into our work. Books like Every Page is Page One and Developing Quality Technical Information have changed the way we organize, structure, and write our documentation. And Docs Like Code has a lot of influence over our designs for an upcoming developer documentation portal. And there's also the time we flipped the script and just went ahead and wrote our own damn book. It's a bit unique in that it isn't actually about writing at all. It's about everything else that we do in this profession. For example, I contributed to a chapter about working with UX designers. Other chapters address subjects like collaborative authoring, dealing with agile, measuring success, and maintaining existing content.
Is this available?
This book is available on Amazon. Maybe doc teams and other companies are reading it in their book clubs, and that would be cool. But let's not get it twisted. The journey from 08 to 18 has not been an unbroken conga line of unicorns and rainbows. This evolution from startup to full-fledged enterprise company hasn't always been a trouble-free experience. The rate of change can feel whiplash-inducing. Rough patches happen. Mistakes are made. A tire blows. That smooth ride you've been on ends up in a ditch by the roadside, and you have to wait for the tow truck to arrive. And at night, the ice weasels come. Evolution can be wearying, but you keep finding reasons to hang in there. I'm a bit wary about supplying advice to get through things like this because everyone's deal breakers are so subjective. So enjoy these bullet points, but realize that results may differ. I constantly have to remind myself that change isn't about me. This is especially true when it comes to style guide changes. While I knew we'd eventually have to move away from that conversational approach, having that knowledge doesn't do much to mediate the frustration you feel when that time finally comes. But you don't need to feel shame about it. After you have a few years in this profession at a variety of employers, you begin to see patterns repeat in companies and doc teams and yourself. It can be calming sometimes to realize that some of the frustrating things you're experiencing tend to come with the territory. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try to change things or make them better. And everything that you encounter, you'll find a way to learn from. And this is actually a quote from Game of Thrones, but might come in handy as long as you don't get yourself beheaded. And finally, I just want to give a shout out to my managers and my coworkers. I don't know that I would have survived these 10 years if I didn't have management that was, didn't kind of have a Zen-like calm, or coworkers who weren't really intelligent and supportive. And they really do help you get through rough patches. And that's about it for me for now, and I'll pass the baton to my colleague Robin, who will talk about content patterns.
All right, thank you. All right. So my name is Robin Pille. I am a principal technical writer on the documentation team here as well, and I have been at Splunk for about 4 years now. And I'm going to talk about how we use structured content in an unstructured authoring environment. What this really means is that I'm going to talk about those content patterns that Matt alluded to in his presentation, and I'm going to elaborate on what those are a little bit. But first, I want to start with why. So we write our docs in a custom MediaWiki platform called PonyDocs. I know a lot of you probably have strong feelings about authoring in a wiki, and as you might imagine, an unstructured environment is a blessing, and it is also a curse, because we can do anything, and yet we can also do anything. So that was a lot easier to manage when we were a smaller team. When I started 4 years ago, there were 14 writers and 1 editor, and now there are 25 writers and growing and 3 editors. And like Matt mentioned, we now support more than 170 unique products. So our documentation needs are continuing to grow and change all the time. So even though all of us are following the same style guide, there are a lot of different ideas about how to structure content, what to include and what to leave out, and how to scope a topic or how to progressively disclose information, how to successfully guide our readers through our content, right? Everyone has different ideas about that. But we agreed as a team that customers would benefit from a consistent experience when they look to our docs for things like REST API reference, troubleshooting guides, installation guides, the kinds of content that we write frequently over and over again in multiple different locations and contexts. So we had the shared goal of giving customers a consistent experience, but because we work in an unstructured wiki, it wasn't really obvious how to make that happen. So our first step was actually inspired by Mark Baker. A while back, we read Every Page is Page One as a team, as Matt mentioned, and we liked it so much that we had Mark Baker come in and do a workshop with us. And Mark Baker is a really big believer in patterns. And he argues that the most successful content on the web, particularly the most successful technical content, tends to follow well-defined patterns. Customers are benefiting from patterns because they make content easy to use, easy to find if it's familiar and predictable. There's also, though, a really big benefit to writers. Using patterns saves us time and it improves the quality of our documentation at the same time. So it makes us better and it makes us faster. In fact, we found that we were already trying to adopt patterns as a team without even realizing it. Across our team, writers were often using an existing content as a guide for writing new content that they needed to write. So for example, I'd see that Brian had documented a procedure in his docs that was really great, and I really liked the way that it was structured. So I made sure to include the same scope of content when I was doing a similar procedure, and I made some of the same choices about when to present information in a table or a list. So this impulse to find and duplicate our best ideas is a really good one, but we weren't all in agreement on what to duplicate because we weren't all necessarily aware of everyone else's best ideas. So we took the step that Mark Baker recommended, which is to start a library of patterns for the content that we write often. So we can figure out the pattern once and then apply it everywhere we need it, and everyone knows where to look to find that pattern later. But as it turned out, this was a little easier to say and plan than it was to actually execute. One of the reasons was that we didn't all agree on what we meant by a content pattern. So we started by clearly defining what we mean. So here's our definition on the Splunk Docs team. Content pattern is a noun. And it is a description of the information design best practices for a frequently documented piece of content. So this is not a data topic type, not a template, right? We really do mean a description of best practices. And it's also not relevant for all of the content that we produce. We really mean that we want to do this for frequently documented content. It doesn't make sense to make a pattern for something that's completely unique. You're only going to write once. And we also don't restrict a pattern in scope to a single topic. For a topic for us is a unique URL, a page on our site. Some patterns might extend over several related topics, and some might actually be necessary only for a very small section. Now, it's worth digging a little bit deeper into what I mean by it's not a template, right? There is a difference between a pattern and a template. It's easy to imagine a template, but it's a lot less easy to understand how a content pattern is not the same thing once you get template in your mind. So, as I said, content pattern describes best practices for information design, whereas the template can actually model the information design. So that means that a content pattern is not going to resemble the information that it describes. However, a template can be a copy-pastable starting point for that content. So it's not a perfect analogy, but you can think of a content pattern as a route map that shows a few ways to get to a destination with some context that helps you make good decisions about which roads you might take in which circumstances. But a template is more like a blueprint. You can use it to get a structure in place very quickly, and then you can add things and customize it from there. They're both really useful, but you don't always need both of these things. So in cases where a template isn't practical, a pattern can still communicate the best practices that are worth capturing and repeating. One of the most important things that we determined about patterns when we started making them is that we really needed to derive them bottom up from the content that we're already writing. We don't impose a pattern top down, and indeed, we actually don't impose them at all, because remember, we're in an unstructured environment and we are not enforcing anything in any way. So when we write a pattern, we look at all of the examples that we can find of the type of content that we want to patternize, and then we build a set of best practices from those examples. So this real content with real variations and the real exceptions, that really helps us make sure that our patterns are flexible enough to accommodate the different needs and different situations that writers will encounter. But it's still helping us improve our docs and save us valuable time by having that pattern. So let's go ahead and take a look at a real content pattern, because so far this has all been theory. Let's look at it in practice. So unfortunately, you guys can't look at this online on our doc site because our content patterns are internal only, just for us to use. I'm zoomed in here on mobile view. It looks okay. All right, so this is a content pattern that we use for release notes in a product called an add-on. We have about 70 of these add-ons, and so as you can imagine, we want to document them all very similarly, make sure they all have the same scope and breadth of content. So the release notes content pattern has a little description. It tells you when to use it, gives you some helpful links, and then describes the pattern, and then has, oh, I'm going to have to zoom out a little bit. All right. Describes the pattern, so the elements in the pattern are listed here. And then each of those elements, we talk about whether that element is required and some helpful information about how you might structure it. So for example, we have maybe an upgrade or migration guide, and we talk a little bit about how to document their new features, fixed issues and known issues, which are things that we automate from Jira. Talks about how to do the transclusion code, automate those, and then how we format our third-party software attributions. And then here at the bottom, we have links to examples of content that are following that pattern right now. So I don't know how everyone else is using patterns, but I like to scroll right to the bottom of the examples and be like, let me see it in practice. So here is release notes for one of these add-ons, and as you can see, it's actually very simple. It doesn't resemble the pattern that we were just looking at. Here's the introduction, a little bit of compatibility, new features, and then the fixed issues and known issues are the tables that are coming in automatically from Jira, and the third-party software attributions. So if I flip back over here, you'll see this is a template, right? So we had the pattern up top, and then the template down here. This is the part that I can just copy-paste right into a new topic and sort of bootstrap it from there. Great. So there's my demo, great. So we're making patterns like these for troubleshooting guides, reference content like release notes, like you just saw, search command definitions, and we're finding that those are pretty straightforward to patternize, but that content that varies a bit more in structure can also really benefit from patterns like tutorials and use cases. So it's really not limited as much as you might think. So content patterns can add helpful structure in unstructured environments, and that structure is helpful to both readers and writers. Readers are benefiting because the content is consistent and following the best practices that we've derived from our real experience. And writers are benefiting because patterns save us time and they keep our work high quality, so we can spend our energy on the new and unique content that deserves more of our creativity. The best patterns always emerge organically from content that we already document frequently. Creating patterns bottom up is ensuring that we're not making patterns just for the sake of patterns, but when they make sense for both the customer and for us as a team. All right, thank you.
My name is Brian Ashby, and I'm a technical writer at Splunk. I've been at Splunk for almost 3 months now, so pretty new still. I actually started my career as a technical writer, going to Write the Docs meetups to try to find a job, so it's pretty cool to be up here presenting in front of you all today. I'll be talking about how Splunk interacts with customers to improve our user-facing documentation. So why do we care about customer feedback? The reason is really simple. We can understand our customers' needs more precisely when we do. When we provide a way for customers to share their thoughts and feelings about our documentation, we're better able to understand what they need and what they expect when they turn to the docs. And we know when we're doing something that customers really like and when we're doing something that we need to start doing differently. Also, people value us when we value them. We care about feedback because it influences people to continue providing that valuable feedback, makes them feel more comfortable relying on the docs when they need help, and as a cool bonus, it kind of helps Splunk's reputation as well. Ultimately, it helps us provide our customers better documentation. If someone shares an issue he or she is having in the docs, chances are multiple people are having that same issue, and when people provide that feedback, we improve the docs, a lot more people benefit. So how do we start a conversation with customers? There are two methods that customers can use to leave feedback, either directly from the docs they're browsing or from community resources that Splunk hosts. The easiest way to leave feedback is directly from a topic in the docs you're browsing. At the bottom of each topic, you have the option to leave a comment that everyone who visits the topic can see. And there are often conversations in the comment section between customers and doc team writers to clear up some confusion. And it's actually really cool to see productive conversations occur in a comment section. And if someone wants the feedback process to be slightly more personal, there's also an option to send feedback directly to the team at the bottom of each topic. And another way we receive feedback is through our community resources. Splunk Answers is a community site where you can ask and answer specific questions relating to Splunk. And doc team writers search the site using tags to find questions that either the docs can address or that we find expose some doc requirement that we add into the docs later. Another great community resource is the Splunk Slack community. Each product has a Slack channel filled with people asking questions and finding answers. And we receive feedback directly from the docs about 250 times each month, and we respond to every single one. So who provides all that feedback every month? Internal customers and external customers. Internal customers are people at Splunk who use the docs as a tool to do their jobs better. We receive feedback from lots of Splunkers in the field, and their feedback is super valuable because they're dealing with many different types of Splunk deployments and use cases. And by extension, they're also testing how well the docs are providing instructions for those deployments. External customers are people not at Splunk who use the docs as a tool to do their jobs better. An external customer who provides feedback could be a seasoned Splunk admin, an analyst using Splunk software for the first time, or an HR manager using something like pivot tables. These customers provide feedback that helps us find areas in which the docs may be confusing or provide less information than is necessary for some people to understand what's really going on. And the types of feedback that we receive most often are probably about pointing out errors and typos in the docs. Our doc readers seem to really enjoy finding and reporting typos and simple errors like this to us. We really appreciate the pedantic feedback, though. That's kind of why we're here, too. I think that some of the best feedback we receive is about the organization or structure of our docs. If someone thinks something is presented in such a way that it's pretty confusing to them, we want to know because it might be confusing to other people as well. I also like feedback where a customer suggests that we document some additional use case or example that we haven't documented yet. It's really cool to see all these types of feedback because it tells us that people are actively searching the docs to help them use Splunk software, and they're invested in our docs too. These people help make our docs much better. Also, some feedback we receive is really just about life, the universe, everything in it except Splunk. I really like that people feel comfortable enough to come to us beyond their documentation needs and questions, but we're not really able or qualified to help with that. So how do we respond to all this feedback? Well, first of all, we respond to every feedback. If you send us feedback, we'll respond and provide a solution to the feedback if we're able, and if we need, we'll update the docs as well. Some people don't provide an email that we can use to respond, but we still try to address the feedback as best we can. And we always respond as fast as possible. When people provide feedback, they generally need help immediately, and if we wait too long, they might have already moved on, and their experience with Splunk is that we're not paying attention to the feedback very well. One of my favorite parts is that we speak directly to customers. When we respond to feedback, whether via email or through our community resources, we interact directly with customers through our personal work emails and usernames, rather than through some doc team alias. I really like this because I think it helps reinforce that we're real people reading and working to address the feedback you guys send in, and having that personal connection, I think, helps our customers as well kind of feel valued. There are, of course, boundaries in how personal our interaction should be. Matt, who just presented a few minutes ago, can probably go into a little bit more detail about the dangers of including a cell phone in an email signature. Most importantly, though, we try to start a conversation with customers. When a customer submits feedback, a doc team writer who can address that feedback reaches out to start a conversation with them. I think this shows that we care about our customers and want to help them with any Splunk-related confusion as best we can. So here's a quick example of some real feedback we received recently. On the next slide, I'll show you how we address that feedback. But this Splunk customer sent in some feedback suggesting that we separate new APIs from updated APIs in our release notes so that users can better identify which ones are new and which ones have just been updated. Now, I really like that this customer is keeping others in mind when submitting the feedback. This person knows that it's probably not just a problem he or she having, and the suggestion would probably benefit a bunch of other people too. This is one of the reasons we even invest in a doc feedback process. Our customers are awesome, and we listen to them, and we need to listen to them to help make the docs better. So here's a little screen capture of the APIs in the release notes. The writer who started talking with the customer totally agreed with the customer and separated the new APIs from the updated APIs in the release notes. It wasn't difficult to do, and it benefited the customer who provided the feedback, and probably a lot of other people looking at the release notes as well. It's a simple but helpful example to illustrate how listening to our customers makes our docs better. When customers see that their suggestions have an impact on the documentation, they're much more likely to continue providing that valuable feedback. We love hearing from customers. Not everyone accepts our invite to have a conversation about the docs, but many customers appreciate our effort to reach out and address the feedback. Some customers even tell us about their experience interacting with the Splunk doc team, and it's pretty cool. Here's one example. So I haven't been in tech writing for very long, just under 2 years still. But I'm kind of surprised that investing in a doc feedback process isn't a cornerstone of every doc team at every company. It really should be. We need to be kind to customers, listen to their feedback. We need to tell them when we make changes based on their feedback. They'll appreciate it. They'll continue using the docs. We'll feel better as doc writers. Everyone wins. Thanks for listening.
Hi, everybody. My name is Robin Berry. So we have two Robins on this panel. I'm a Senior Director of Engineering, and let's move on to the engineering perspective of documentation. So I feel honored to be welcome to join the panel today, and want to tell you about what engineering really appreciates about documentation. And I can tell you right away, I've only been here for 9 months, right? And so I use documentation almost immediately, right? I had to learn a lot about products in the area where my engineers focus, right? So a lot of times there's always new lingo when you come into a company, right? So I always ended up on the docs right away, learning about different technical add-ons, how enterprise works, all of those things. And so from engineers' point of view, they see that same value. They know customers are going to the documentation to understand how to take advantage of all that code they wrote, right? So I definitely hire engineers that are thinking about that, right? Generally they can write documentation themselves. Usually they write it in a way that's a little too technical, which is why we need technical writers to help kind of smooth it over and actually have it make sense for end users so they can digest it. So when you're working with engineers, I think what you want to do is let them know, if they haven't worked with technical writers before, kind of let them know what you do. Share with them your skills and experience, right? And start sharing with them, here's how we can collaborate. Some of you may be able to read code, and so you let them know, like, I can read through the code and start to understand it. And for others of you, you might want to meet with the engineer, maybe interview them, ask some questions about the code they just wrote, right? And start to understand, what's this algorithm all about? How do I document this in a way that's going to make sense to our end users? And finally, make sure you're providing them some guidance. So in terms of how you can work together, it can often be an individual conversation, right? So different engineers may want to interact with you in different ways. So just having the conversation with them up front, I think, is a great way to get started. And I think, if you're in an environment where engineers aren't taking your work seriously, I certainly would want to hear about it. So, I think engineering leadership doesn't want that to happen. We know that the documentation matters, and we want to make sure you get the information you need so you can do your jobs. So, one of the things I want to talk about too is get in early, right? So I'm not talking about getting into the office, but getting into the process of software development as early as possible. One story I can tell you is Clayton, who's in our Vancouver office, recently joined the company, and we asked him to work on one of our add-ons. It's for Unix and Linux operating systems. It's how we get data in from those operating systems into Splunk. And so we brought him in early enough that he could see what work was about to happen, and then he looked at the documentation. Now here's like the scary story. It was way out of date. There had been many patches, many updates to this add-on, and the documentation kind of degraded over time. And then he did something I would expect an engineer to do. He rewrote it. He said, this is just, it's gone too far, right? But we got him in early enough, he had the time. He could put together some options and say, how do we handle this situation? So again, I want to just reiterate, wherever you can, try to get into the process as early as possible. When I think about software development, there are all these aspects that are moving through, projects move through these processes again and again. Each version, we're kind of doing this planning and research, implementation and release. And so maybe the majority of your time is in this latter half, right? When engineers are implementing it, you might be the first person to test it, right? You're actually going to be writing the documentation, and so you're seeing the code for the first time, maybe in a staging environment. But what I would say is things that you learn from the feedback from your customers could go into planning, could go into user experience design, any of the research that happens up front. So as much as I want you interacting with engineering, I would love to see also that you're talking to the product managers. And so, we can all work together to improve the product overall. As it stands, documentation is an extension of support. It's the first place customers go before they create a ticket, right, with their account manager. So just to bring it back around, I definitely appreciate the value of documentation and want it to be a part of our full process. And now I'm going to pass it back to Chris.
We're going to go to questions and answers now, so panelists, come on back. We'll have Jesse Evans, our lead technical editor, moderate this discussion.
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to speak up really loudly so that the mics in the room can pick up your question, and I'll do my best to repeat it, and we'll go for it. So it looks like we have some questions already.
Yeah, just a quick mechanical question for Robin and Phil about the patterns and the development of them. They grow organically, and to me that implies that they're going to change. And some may actually fall out of use, fall out of application, or need to be combined or otherwise. So how do you track these? Are they tagged? Is there a tag in a template that you might apply? How do you track that? How do you manage patterns once they've grown and been applied?
So can you repeat the question?
The question is, how do we manage patterns once they've grown, once the content that they need to apply to changes? Because if we're creating our patterns organically, then how are we keeping up with the organic changes to the documentation? That is something that we are thinking about, and we believe that the patterns that we write are not finished when we put them into the library of our patterns. And so every single time someone writes content using that pattern, they may have some experience with it, like, oh, actually, this thing should be in the pattern that is missing as well. And so we can keep working on that pattern forever. It's a starting point and a place from which we can grow. And I do want to mention, because we have one of our wonderful technical editors up here, that another way that we use the patterns is that our editors know about them all and edit against them. So if we submit content that is or should be conforming to a pattern, the editor will edit with that pattern in mind and point out places in which we might have missed some best practices that we could have applied in that content. And that's a really great conversation that we can then have with that editor to say, oh, but this is different for this reason, and we need to add this to the pattern. So this is part of our ongoing process. And you'll notice that a lot of the things that we talk about are about how we adapt constantly in order to the changing needs.
Hi, what's your question?
Question for Brian. I was wondering, do you have a problem of spam bots putting spam comments into your comment section of your documentation? And if you do, how do you try to prevent that?
Are spam bots a problem? Here with Brian.
So my experience with the feedback process so far has been that spam isn't really an issue. We do get spam occasionally, but it's a small percentage of the overall feedback we get, and it usually just sits in the email folder and just kind of dies there.
I'm talking about on the pages of the
Oh, people leave comments. So I haven't. Other people who've been here a little bit longer might speak more to that, but I haven't seen really any spam on the comments. And I think if there were spam on the comments, we could just take care of those. So that might be why I also don't see any spam. But there's not really a spam issue with the comment section.
I'll add really quickly that we have, so that's true on the comments. We also have a Splunk Answers site where there's a much bigger community of people who are posting all the time answers and questions and answers and talking to each other. And that's curated a little bit, so we're controlling for spam there in the entry point so that there really isn't that much spam in our community. It's something that I think people find really valuable. One of the reasons that they keep coming back to our answers and to our docs because they know that the content that they're getting there is written by humans.
Thank you. Who else has a question?
This is probably for Robin. I'm looking at your Splunk add-on for Akamai doc.
Oh boy, Akamai.
Here, and it's gorgeous.
Gorgeous is what I heard.
And I'm just wondering, and you said you're using Jira and you're using, I guess, Confluence or Wiki. How do you do this?
How do we do it, Robin?
It's obviously structured.
So the question, you happen to be looking at the Splunk add-on for Akamai, but I think this would probably apply to all of the documentation that we write, really is how we do it. So if you've ever worked in MediaWiki before, PonyDocs is really just a version of that. And so we can author right in that environment and publish, and it has some CSS applied. Is that what your question is about, or am I not getting there?
It looks like, it's like it's coding with HTML5 or something directly, but it's coming out of, you're using CSS with
MediaWiki. Yeah, so it's PonyDocs is basically a customization of MediaWiki. Like she said, CSS on top, and we've also made it available as an open source authoring platform that other companies can use. So if you're really excited about it, then you could put it to work for you. Yeah. Oh well. One of the things that's really go ahead.
I recommend it to anybody.
Yeah. One of the things that's really nice about it is it also allows really easy versioning of docs. So our customers can go in and see the docs for whatever version of software they're on just by clicking a drop down. And so you can tie an entire set of manuals to that same version for whatever product.
I did use, a long time ago, used Flare to get a response page and that was good. So I was really
Glad to hear it.
Any more questions out there? Yes.
Writers often get pushback about going to docs because of the translation localization costs.
How do we manage pushback from?
About the cost of localization and translation existing costs and people, how to balance that out.
How do we balance translation costs and changing the content to meet those? Matt, how about you want to take that one? This one?
Well,
you guys can share. It's questions can be shared.
I'm not sure that the writers are necessarily feeling that pressure necessarily. So I've worked at companies that actually measured out how much cost per word translation was costing. We're not at that point yet. So yeah, we're not quite at Oracle's speed yet. So that's all I can say really. Chris might have more to, yeah.
So the two ends of that question to me are, what do these fine people do? And what these fine people do is make our content as lean as possible. So using content patterns, working with editors, just thinking intelligently about what they're writing, we strive to make our content as lean as possible so that it's as easy to translate as we can make it and as low cost to translate as we can make it. And also, equally if not more important, it's easy for non-native speakers to read because there's always going to be literally an entire world of people out there whose native language is something you're not translating into. So that's really important to us. So that's the writing and editing. And on the justifying the cost end, my experience at Splunk has been kind of the opposite. I am usually fending off translation requests rather than trying to defend translation work that we're doing. I get a lot of requests from area managers in the field to add languages, and it is on me to push back on them to make the business case for doing that, not the other way around.
How many languages?
How many languages do you do?
We translate the Splunk enterprise documentation into 4 languages. We translate 2 other products into a kind of Venn diagram of languages, so it's 7 overall. And then the user interface itself is translated into 7 languages.
And to all of that, I will add that we strive to have a Splunky tone to our writing. So we want to make sure that it's casual, readable, but also lean and friendly. So all of that.
Is your book club mandatory and how often do you meet?
Book club is, the reading is mandatory, but not the like book club. So, you know, some people have meetings, you can't make it. You gotta do, you know, hours and hours of backlog combing with your team, that sort of thing. You got stand up, it's in the way. But we strive to do the reading for writing together as a team so we have that common language and we're all aware of those best practices that are coming out of those readings that we're doing together. But I totally just answered that question instead of the panelists. So, hey panelist, anybody else want to talk about required reading? Oh, we meet once a month. And sometimes a reading will span over a month if it's a really lengthy reading that, you know, it's kind of it's a tough read. You know, some of the writing books got us through a couple of months. Do I Make Myself Clear by Harold Evans took us 3 months, I think.
So I noticed you had the Steven Pinker book on there. Was that helpful?
Oh, so you so get up. Can you repeat the question for us?
We're a very opinionated team. Oh, the question was about the Steven Pinker book, the Sense of Style, and I don't want to say anything badly about anyone's book because how wonderful it is to have written a book. How we would never want it criticized, would we? But one of the things so this actually is relevant to our own book, which we mentioned before. We've written one as a team, and this doesn't come up as much for us because we aren't writing about writing style. But one of the things that we noticed and talked about as a team is how difficult it is to write a book about writing style and then follow all your own rules while you are doing it. And so we were constantly just being, well, this sentence, I don't know about, you know, so.
I don't know if I can really expand on that, but yeah, I wouldn't say that book was probably the #1 favorite book of the book club. But, you know, everything's worth reading, so it's worth checking out.
And we get to talk about all of those feelings and opinions and share them as a group in the book club. I kind of like the book, but okay.
So an issue I feel like a lot of technical writers run into is that your customer base doesn't want to read the documentation. They just want to go straight to the engineers and get their answer spoon-fed to them. So I was wondering if there's any measures you've implemented in these conversations you've had with customers that you found particularly effective in getting people to reach out less to the engineers and going to the documentation for reference.
Customers don't like to read. They want to go directly to engineering. And in our interactions with doc feedback and the customer, how do we encourage them to use the docs and answer their own questions instead of relying on the relationship that we've opened up with that doc feedback, right?
I think one of the most helpful things is how accessible leaving feedback is. So we invite customers to read the docs, and it's super easy for them to get in touch with someone who's not an engineer. And that's one of the reasons we try to be so responsive, is that when they send in feedback, they know they're going to get a response, so they don't feel the need to go anywhere else. That's kind of one of the big reasons why we have that feedback process.
I think also, I would always coach engineers to show the customer where the documentation is, right? So there would always be, hey, I can help you out, we're on a call, something like that. Let's say that's happening. But did you know, right over here, it's fully documented. Here's how you configure this add-on, da 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 da, right? So, I mean, I think there's something engineers can do to help maybe kind of redirect people as well. But I mean, I know typically if I were on a customer call, I'd try to help them on the spot, but always let them know, you could also access this on your own. And a lot of times they may not have been able to find it, and they'll value that once they know where it is. So things like that happen.
I'd say one place you see customers going to ask, kind of looking for engineer type help, is our answers site. And the doc team is encouraged to go in there and find these kinds of questions. And when I go in there, I will give as good an answer as I can provide that answers the question, but I'll also include doc links. And other engineers have seen that and will do that as well. And so there's a constant kind of feedback loop of people being returned to the docs, even when they're, not specifically looking to go there.
Yeah. And I think part of the feedback is that they couldn't find the documentation, that they are in fact asking to be synced with the piece of the feedback itself.
I was wondering about the support. I mean, the questions are coming in. Sometimes they're like support type questions. Maybe you have another way of support.
Right.
And so sometimes that can take a lot of time. Do you have a process for triaging them or assigning which writer will reply?
So the question is about when a doc feedback question is really a support question in disguise sometimes, and also the length of time it can take a writer to research the answer for the customer. How do we handle that? We'll get multiple answers.
So I think one thing I'd say is when the feedback comes in, the writers, doesn't get auto-assigned to writers. We basically look at it and writers will go, me, I'll take it. So basically every day I have a special folder in my email that's just all the feedbacks that come in, and I'll just click through them and see which ones apply to the stuff that I wrote. And we have a fairly good idea of who owns what stuff, and so we'll take that. Then the tricky part comes, if you can't immediately see an answer to it, you have to write back to the customer and say something like, what are you trying to do here? What's going on? And that's where you sometimes end up going down a rabbit hole that can be really interesting, because the more interesting ones for me are the ones where the question they're asking turns out to be way far away from the real problem. And so that'll take a while to figure out, and then sometimes you can solve that problem, and sometimes you realize this is a support issue, and then you advise them to go to support. And that's basically the best you can do. There often is a point where you have to kind of shunt them to support. But the whole point is not if you can avoid doing that, that's great. That's a good deal for them. But some things you just can't solve. So yeah. And that whole thing with the customer that got my phone number because I wasn't thinking, that was one of these things where like I didn't know what, we went back and forth, and it turned out he wanted me to write a regular expression for him, which isn't my job. And so I tried to get him to go to support, and then he started phoning me. And that was a learning moment for me.
I agree with Matt there. Just kind of add on, like we will try to take on the support question if we can. Sometimes like I'll link to the docs if it's somewhat helpful, and if I can't answer it, I'll try. But if it goes beyond what I know or what the doc team is really responsible for, and it'll take a lot of resources, like Matt said, send them to support a little bit with a little bit of a push. Oftentimes I'll go to Splunk Answers, and that's a perfect spot for those types of support questions. Even the Slack community that we have is also good for getting some immediate help from some of the engineers and developers who are sitting in those channels. So give them a little help when we can, and then push them along to where they're going to get some help that they can really use.
And I know you were asking specifically about questions that turn out to be support questions, but we also get a lot of questions from doc feedback that turn out to be feedback about the product, not about the documentation. And that's wonderful. It's a great way for customers to reach us very quickly. And often what we can do there is we can turn that into a JIRA and pass that on to our wonderful engineering team and get back to the customer to tell them that we've done that, and then they can wait for that in another release.
I think we have time for 1, 2, 4 questions. Yeah?
So I actually have 2 questions.
Okay, we're going to end on a two-parter.
First is, how closely do you work with UX to try to get them to do a lot more sort of on-screen? My thought process has always been to basically have UX put me out of a job. I mean, we're never going to get there, but I try to work very closely with them in order to make sure that they are creating screens that are intelligent. So how do you guys work that out?
Okay, so that's part 1. How do we work with UX to get that information that the customers need on the screen so that maybe they don't have to look at the documentation?
Yeah, so I might have mentioned I wrote a chapter in our book about this. So that was a while ago. And I think I wrote it after having a kind of a tempestuous relationship with the UX designer. And I think we had another writer kind of join and kind of give the opposite side of that, which, was the, fluffy bunny experience. But in any case, my philosophy about this is if I am looking at a UI that I'm going to have to waste a lot of time explaining what it does, then it's not designed well. If we're going to have to take a lot of screenshots of it so that I can point people how to get around the page, then it's not designed well. And that's where I end up being kind of annoying in design review meetings. And ideally, the best UX designers, and I've worked with a lot of really good ones at Splunk, know where I'm coming from, and they understand, oh, okay, right, yeah, let's do this, let's do the other thing, or whatever. And you have some interesting conversations, but ideally then you solve that, and you get to a point where, so it's kind of don't make me work hard, is kind of the attitude. But it's you don't want to make your customers work hard. You're the advocate for the customer. That's my attitude. So it goes beyond just, I used to think my early part of my career, I used to think, oh, this is just about making sure that the fields are labeled correctly and nobody's misspelling anything. There's a lot more to it than that, and yeah, so.
So I agree. I think part of it is understanding how to give constructive criticism and also ensuring a person can be open to feedback. So that's just a general thing. But I think also you can follow the same practices. Sometimes people in an organization feel like this is my role and this is what I do, and you have your role and you do that, and there's a big border between us. And I'd actually prefer to be in an organization where we could say an idea could come from anyone. So it could be coming from the CEO, but it could be coming from a tech writer, or it could be coming from an engineer, and it can help improve the product. So I'd prefer we get in a collaborative mindset and that's how we work together. But yeah, I think like Matt said, sometimes you end up in a situation where a person just assumes, well, that's not really for you to worry about. You just write the documentation. That's probably what some people think, right? And so I think, again, come back and let them know, let me share with you what I know, right? This is how I interact with customers. This is the kind of feedback I get. So, I can give you some value here in terms of doing this user experience.
Thanks. Can we take your second part of your question to, the after party? All right, so we're just at time, and the panelists and other Splunkers will be around after. We love talking to other documentarians, so please come up and chat with us, and Chris is gonna close our evening here.
Thanks. I'm almost gonna close the evening, I think. One of you has a final. Okay, Jessica has maybe the final announcement. Yeah, it's like Return of the King. There's like 7 endings. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who came. Thank you for coming. Thank you to all the people inside Splunk and from local Write the Docs who helped organize this event. We really appreciate all the effort that everyone put into making this a great evening. And thank you to our panelists, to our speakers, for working on their presentations and taking the time out of their evening to talk to you and answer your questions. So thank you. One more round of applause for these fine people. Matt mentioned The Product is Docs, the book that the doc team at Splunk wrote. If that piqued your interest, we have copies for you, so come up afterwards and you can pick up a copy of the book. We welcome your feedback. We also welcome your reviews on Amazon, because that's always important to help a book find its market. Totally unbiased reviews, please, I really mean it. We hope the book is useful for you. The team put a lot of effort into it to help drive a conversation in the profession that we didn't really see covered in many books and articles. With that, I just want to say thank you again, and Jessica will take us back to Write the Docs land.
I don't have too much to add on top of that. Everybody's already said there's lots of Splunkers around, talk to them. And the only other thing I want to say is the Slack is at slack.writethedocs.org, and our channel for the South Bay group is South Bay-chapter. So you can add that channel if you want to find out about stuff in here. Obviously also on the Meetup group on meetup.com. The next one coming up is in San Francisco, which is developer experience for APIs, and that's on June 26th at Atlassian in San Francisco. And our next one for South Bay, we're looking at the 2nd or 3rd week in July, and we'll put that up pretty soon. And if your company is interested in hosting any of the meetups here, South Bay, East Bay, San Francisco, talk to us. We'd love to hear from you. It's a great recruiting opportunity. You can talk to the Splunk people about that. And you don't necessarily have to have this big fancy spread like they did. That's okay. So if you just have a space, that's a great start. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And I think now, is there anyone else here who's hiring besides Splunk people who'd like to? Okay, so also talk to Alicia here if you're interested in looking and any Splunkers. All right, thank you.